This is Paul Welke for the Dominion. Today we're speaking with Tim Moen, leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada, here in the Weir Law Library at the University of Alberta. As we've done in previous interview videos, I'd like to start by briefly acknowledging bias on my part. I am a member of the Libertarian Party of Canada, and I currently also sit on their ethics committee. Now, while Canada has a vast body of constitutional law, we're going to focus on the 1867 and 1982 Acts today, specifically the Division of Powers and the 1867 British North America Act, and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which makes up Part 1 of the 1982 Act. Now, Tim, not too many people are familiar with the Libertarian Party of Canada, but you did achieve some notoriety in the last federal election with a meme that kind of does a pretty good job of summing up the position. Can you maybe just tell us what that one was about?
Yeah, well, the meme was, I want gay married couples to be able to protect their marijuana plants with guns. And we literally had no idea what we were doing at the time. I had just entered politics. It was kind of by accident, and I had this team of kind of creative people just throwing different slogans and memes at the wall to see what sticks, and that one stuck. It was it went around the world. We saw it in New Zealand, in Germany, in Spain, in the US, and it led to basically catapulting me into the international spotlight, and eventually led to me becoming leader of the party as a result. So, the meme itself just simply says, libertarians are often mistaken as libertines, right? That we just want to be able to have gay sex and do lots of drugs and just, live this kind of libertine lifestyle. I'm not interested in any of those things. I live a fairly conservative lifestyle myself, but the basis behind the meme is to promote the idea that there's an underlying principle here in Western civilization, and that is the idea of individual rights, that an individual should be able to do what they want, provided they don't harm anyone else. And so that meme kind of illustrated the point, and kind of it was designed to pull people out of the frame of left versus right. And so people often describe us as either, I guess, socially liberal and fiscally conservative at the same time, and that meme kind of highlights that. But I like to say that sometimes the liberals are socially libertarian and sometimes the conservatives are fiscally libertarian. I prefer to see things through a libertarian lens than through the lens of the left versus the right. We generally prefer to see the world in terms of authoritarianism versus a respect for individual rights.
Oh, excellent. Okay, well, looking back 150 years, and from the perspectives of your party, are you generally happy with the current division of powers and how the federal government is responsible for certain things and the provincial government for others?
Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of a continual debate among libertarians and in the party in general. There are some people that like the idea of kind of a broad federal government that enforces liberty from on high and kind of imposes liberty on the provinces, so that the provinces can't get away with authoritarian kind of regimes and that sort of thing. I generally like the other approach. I think that there's a bigger risk when you have a government with a big jurisdiction like that. We inevitably see government grow, never shrink, and so I think when you set up a system like that, it tends to grow and become more authoritarian over time. And I think that a good protection against that is a decentralized approach, where smaller jurisdictions like provinces and First Nations are kind of given the authority to govern themselves and that sort of thing. So, my general approach is, if I'm a federal libertarian politician, I ought to be promoting the idea of decentralizing authority to the provinces and First Nations. If I'm a provincial libertarian politician, I'm looking at ways of decentralizing and empowering municipalities to self-govern and that sort of thing. And I think that over time, that kind of marketplace of different rule sets trends towards more virtue and away from more authoritarianism.
Okay, are there any specific spheres that you think that the provinces should have control over as opposed to the federal government?
Well, I think definitely, well, maybe I'll just talk about things that I can see that the federal government may be better off taking care of.
Okay.
And so, things like geographic defense of the nation, right? So if we're going to have this nation called Canada, it does need to be protected from invasion from outside, from foreigners and that sort of thing. There's probably a role to play in terms of negotiating trade and trying to lower trade barriers, you know, sitting at an international table with other nations and that sort of thing. We need a representative there that represents the total sum of Canada to a certain extent. And I think that there's probably a role for a higher court that people can appeal to in terms of decisions and dispute resolution if they don't get satisfaction at the problem. So I think that there is a role, and this is something that I still wrestle with. You know, this separation of provincial and federal powers. It's something that I go back and forth on quite a lot because there are frankly good arguments to be made on both sides. Like perhaps we ought to have this kind of bedrock constitution that protects liberty for all across the country and you know, lowers trade barriers, for example, between provinces and that sort of thing. You know, our friends at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, for example, do great work in terms of interprovincial trade. I know there was a case recently, I believe it was in the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, where a gentleman went over and bought $150 worth of beer across the provincial lines and then was fined for bringing it back. And you know, the fine was relatively small. It was only a few $100s, but you know, there's a case to be made that those kind of fines shouldn't exist. And so I do think that there is an opportunity for the federal government to provide a framework or a constitution that restrains governments across the country to fall within this sort of national value system that defines our nation. Where exactly that line is, I'm not sure. You know, for example, I don't think the Constitution goes far enough at restricting government. Law would be a good example of this. So the idea of legislating is something that libertarians generally oppose. So we would prefer to see justice be discovered rather than legislated. Okay. And so, for example, you know, it used to be under, you know, Roman law or law merchant or even English common law that laws were discovered by courts, and so there was a series of cases that you would base your decision on, the precedent of those cases, and it was, you know, a judge would struggle with how is justice best served, and rather than what is the letter of the law, you know, and so now we see in courts that justices are concerned with what does the letter of the law say, and does this behavior in the public sphere follow the legislated letter of the law, rather than try to wrestle with what is just here, how can we restore justice, what was it that was done, and try to discover the underlying principles that make the law. So you know, things like restricting the legislature, for example, or the House to maybe overturning or rewriting decisions. So, for example, you have an egregious line of cases that result in kind of egregious harm that is widely recognized to be outside the bounds of justice. Rather than legislating, perhaps the House ought to rewrite or better codify or articulate the principles of justice that ought to emerge from those set of cases and establish a new precedent rather than a new legislation. And so that then going forward, as courts look at matters involving that kind of case law, they refer to that precedent. And so maybe the House ought to be there as a corrective measure to kind of, you know, lines of justice that get off course. But right now we see the other way, which is that you know, we have special interests warring with each other, and the legal future is uncertain, and this has all sorts of unintended consequences. And so, you know, I think that a kind of bottom-up approach to law, this kind of organic development of common law and discovery of law, leads to far better consequences than what we see now. And so I prefer a constitution that restricts government's action in that kind of area. Yes.
You've mentioned how you don't believe that the charter necessarily restricts the government enough. In what ways?
Well, obviously, you know, I mentioned private property isn't enshrined in the charter, so you know, that would have dramatic effects on what the government could or couldn't do to you. That would probably be the most, because there's a lot of things that you could argue in front of a court that would potentially infringe your property rights, including taxation. I mean, that's a pretty big thing. That's a big part of our life. That could potentially be challenged under a charter right that protected private property, but also things like expropriation of your land and different things like that for public works and that sort of thing. But you know, some of the other ways that you know, that there are all sorts of this kind of escape hatches in the charter. You would hope that a charter worth its weight would be able to protect free speech as an inviolable right, for example, but we see human rights commissions across the country you know, really infringing on people's right to free speech. You know, we saw 2 recent cases with comedians, one in Vancouver and one in Quebec, get fined large sums because they insulted or offended some people. And you know, I would prefer that there be some protection for speech that doesn't have those kinds of escape clauses that allow a human rights commission to basically ruin someone's life over that kind of speech. So, you know, there are definitely ways the charter can be improved, but again, it represents moral progress as far as I'm concerned, in that it offers more protections for the individual, and it does restrict government and provides the individual some recourse to challenge the government. I mean, I was involved in a case last year, Allard versus the Crown, by it was a constitutional challenge brought on by some cannabis growers that faced having their licenses to grow for themselves suspended or removed, and it was challenged constitutionally. I appeared as an expert witness in that case, and we won the case, thankfully, because it was recognized that they had a right under the Constitution to grow cannabis for personal use. So it would be hard for me to say that there wasn't some use for that document, because I have seen it protect individuals in Canada from a government that wants to impose its will.
Okay, great. With regards to the reasonable limits clause in Section 1 of the Charter, do you think that needs to be changed, or do you just think the application of it has been questionable?
Well, again, you know, we expect, as I talked about in the first question, when you have the law being perceived as that which is legislated from on high, you have this competition of special interests. And so I don't know that there's any real way to protect against that by enshrining, you know, some kind of, I mean, I think it would definitely be an improvement to get rid of that, or maybe clarify exactly what exceptions could be made somehow, because it's too broad and open to interpretation, and one could imagine as, you know, society becomes more interested, for example, in equality of outcome rather than protection of individual rights, that the goalposts could shift over time, and that notwithstanding clause would be interpreted in a different way. So I would prefer to see that cleaned up, but the ultimate remedy, in my perspective, is to move away from this kind of legislative style of law dictated from on high, rather than law as a process of discovering what are natural rights and what the natural order ought to be, what are the underlying principles. So, you know, ultimately I think it's a real structural problem that we'll have to contend with at some point in our future if we want a sustainable nation. But, you know, certainly clarifying it would probably go a long ways to helping people in the here and now.
Okay, great. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Our guest today has been Tim Moen, leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada for the Dominion. Thanks for watching.